Wow. Thank you all very much, and particularly thank you to those of you who were caught up in the traffic accident earlier that seemed to slow down traffic for a little while, so we're grateful you're here. Now, I do want to set one thing straight at the very beginning. We were talking with Alex earlier about, and I'm very grateful to you with the MC here, about having a job town hall meeting. And he said on this particular day, a substantial number of you may think that a job meeting is about Coach Kelly. I just want to report, I'm sorry, that's not the topic tonight, but I can appreciate that it's a matter of high anxiety. And congratulations on both of your remarkable football teams this year. You're having a pretty good year. I want to set the stage for what we're going to talk about tonight with a slogan, if you will, formula, that I think is maybe the most useful insight to where we are today. And I want to use this to frame our whole conversation about jobs and government. I encountered this concept when Callista and I were working on a film that will come out next year called 9 Days That Changed the World, which is a study of Pope John Paul II visiting Poland for 9 days in 1979, which both Lech Wałęsa, the former president of Poland, and Václav Havel, the former president of the Czech Republic, said to us was the most important moment in the beginning of the end of the Soviet Empire, because when the Pope went back home as a Polish Pope, the power of religious liberty and the power of salvation was such that the Polish people were never the same again. And they engaged in a 10-year-long struggle with the Soviet state. And in that process, one of the slogans they came up with was 2 + 2 = 4. Now, I know that's not your normal political slogan. But they would print signs and put them in their windows, 2 + 2 = 4. They would pass them out at rallies. Part of it came from George Orwell, who wrote in 1984 about the state torturer torturing the innocent citizen and saying to the citizen, if we tell you 2 + 2 = 5, it equals 5, and if we tell you 2 + 2 = 3, it equals 3. And the citizen's thinking, but what if 2 + 2 = 4? Part of it comes from Camus' novel, The Plague, in which he says, there are times when a man will be killed for saying 2 + 2 = 4 because the authorities can't stand the truth. So I want to talk about 2 + 2 = 4. Let me give you an American analogy. And I'm going to lead this into talking about jobs in a minute, but I want to start out with an example of an American analogy. I'm going to give you half of a sentence, and then I want you to see if you can figure out the second half. If you can't afford to buy a house, okay. Okay, how many of you agree if you can't afford to buy a house, don't buy it? Raise your hand if you agree with that. Virtually unanimous, right? Now, I want you to think about what I just said. For the last 25 years, we've been lying. We've said to people, if you can't afford to buy a house, we will avoid looking at your credit rating. We'll let you get in the house without a down payment. We'll allow you to pay a subprime mortgage. And we'll allow you to pay no principal for the first 3 years. And by the way, since you can't afford to buy a house, when we're done with all those gimmicks, you'll go bankrupt. Now, if one person goes bankrupt, it's a family tragedy. If 1 million people go bankrupt, it's a national crisis. And yet, have you heard any of your national leaders say to you, the entire mess we're in is cultural? It all starts with being honest. So let's talk about 2 + 2 = 4. We have gone through a period here where we came out of World War II with enormous advantages. And for about 50 years, we were the dominant country on the planet by a huge margin. Now, right after World War II, we had obvious advantages because we had bombed most of our competitors. But it's not, frankly, a technique you can use very often. And so now everybody's rebuilt, and other countries have entered the game. And so the question begins to be, how are you going to create real jobs that last competing with China and India? And I think this is a very serious, fundamental question. Because I don't know about you, but I'm frankly very uncomfortable when the Saudis control the world's oil price and the Chinese have $2 trillion of American debt. I'm not saying that they're good or bad. I'm just saying I'm uncomfortable having that kind of debt sitting out there. And so then you say, so what would it take to change it? Now, the reason that we felt at American Solutions we were very critical of the way the president's approaching the summit tomorrow is we think that it's going to basically not lead to anything. Because, first of all, to the best of my knowledge, he has no small businesses in the summit. And yet 3 out of 4 new jobs come from small businesses. What he does have is very large corporations, labor unions, left-wing academics, government people. A recent study by the American Enterprise Institute said that of every president from George Washington to the present, this president has the fewest people in senior office who've ever held a private sector job. So when they get together in a room to talk about job creation, what you have is one government bureaucrat talking to another government bureaucrat, chatting with a politician, none of whom know anything about jobs. And they're faced with an enormous intellectual challenge. Because if you come out of a background where you believe in redistributing wealth, and it hasn't occurred to you that somebody needs to create it before you redistribute it. My good friend, who many of you know, Congressman Bob McEwen, said, it's a little bit like trying to explain to somebody how you get corn on a farm. And because we all understand the work ethic and we all understand the basic rules, we know you've got to clear the ground, you've got to plow the ground, you've got to go get some seed, which takes capital to buy the seed, then you've got to plant the seed, then you've got to be able to fertilize the seed, then you've got to take out the weeds, then you eventually get to harvest the corn. But if you don't understand all that, and what you say is, why don't we have a corn rally? We're all going to get together and chant, we want corn. Or why don't we have a corn summit? We'll get a group of people who've never farmed, we'll all get together, and we'll try to imagine, how do you think corn occurs? Or like Al Gore, we'll get a group of green corn people, and they'll all come together, and they'll... So at American Solutions, we're taking a very different approach. And I want to make this really clear. What motivates me at this point in my life is 2 grandchildren. Maggie's 10 and Robert's 8. And let me say as a brief commercial that Maggie will be in the Nutcracker this Christmas. If you're in Atlanta, I recommend highly you go to the Fox Theater. She'll be terrific. She's not yet the prima ballerina, but that comes later. Anyway, so my view is, what do we need to do so that when my grandchildren are in their 40s and 50s, they're in the most creative, most productive, and most prosperous country in the world, because that's what we have to be if we're going to be safe. And by the way, I think the president basically got that right last night. There's a brief passage in his speech, which I'm going to put in my next book, in which he actually talks about the fact that prosperity is the key to security. And he's right, because if you don't have a strong economy, you can't possibly sustain our national security system. I'm not sure he got the details of how you get to the prosperity right, but that wasn't last night's speech, so I'm not going to hold him to it. So start with that question. What did we have to do? Well, we believe at American Solutions that this is a big challenge. That in order to be capable of competing with China and India, you have to go through very fundamental reforms. And so we look at litigation, regulation, taxation, education, health, energy, and infrastructure, which is a lot. And we think it's not just Washington, it's not just the White House. We think county government, city government, the school board, the state legislature, we've all got to be part of solving this. And now we come to jobs. James Carville, back in 1992, had a sign in the Clinton campaign headquarters in Little Rock that said, "It's the economy, stupid." And I've suggested that the president would be well served to borrow the sign and put it up in the Oval Office and begin every single meeting by saying, what do we need to do to create jobs? And when you're at 10.2% unemployment nationally, and the larger unemployment number, including part-time workers and those who quit looking, is 17.5%. In California, it's every fifth Californian. You know, if you're not focused on creating jobs, you don't get it. But if they focus on creating jobs, the first thing they'll have to do is stop killing them. And that would mean give up on an energy tax increase that'll kill jobs. And that would mean giving up on a health insurance plan that is going to kill jobs. And that would mean rejecting tax increases next year that are going to kill jobs. And so at American Solutions, we stopped and said, all right, if they're, and they clearly are not going to do that. I mean, I will sing the president's praises if he walks out of the meeting tomorrow and says, you know, I'm so convinced of the need to create jobs that I'm giving up on all these things that will kill jobs. I mean, if he does that, I'll be glad to praise him. I don't expect that to be a major obligation, but I'd be prepared to do it. Because I think, frankly, when he does something that's right, we ought to say that's the right thing to do. Now, we decided we'd reach out, so we've had a series of meetings with entrepreneurs, small business leaders, and we said, what would really create jobs for America? What would really dramatically enable us to get out of the current mess? How do we get 2 + 2 = 4 in the job market? We come up with 3 large areas. 1, control federal spending and reform the government so that you can get back to a balanced budget. 2, create an American energy plan which enables us to use American coal, American oil, American gas, American nuclear power, American biofuels. The truth is, if you look at our total energy resources, we may have the most energy resources of any country on the planet, and we've allowed government to artificially create a requirement that we import hundreds of billions of dollars of fuel. And I'd rather have the money spent in the Ohio River Valley than have it spent in Venezuela. The third thing we're proposing at American Solutions is 5 major tax changes. And I want you to understand why we're doing this. We want to design a package which helps every American who's working, helps every American who wants to have a job, helps small business, which is the center of creating jobs. And so we looked around the world and we said, if we're really serious about competing with China and India, what would we have to do to create the right dynamic for America? And here are the 5 proposals. 1, we would have a 50% reduction in the Social Security and Medicare tax for the next 2 years for both workers and employers match, so that every worker in America would have an increase in take-home pay, and every small business would have a substantial additional amount of money available so we could make sure their cash flow was adequate without going to the bank, and we could allow them to start thinking about hiring new workers. At the same time, we would begin an entitlement reform process so that before we ran out of the 2 years, we began to offer a fundamental change so we could actually take care of the entitlements without bankrupting the country. Second, we would have 100% expensing, that means writing off, all new investments in equipment for small businesses so that the American workforce could have the best equipment, the most modern equipment, the most productive equipment in the world, which would also create a boom in the equipment manufacturing industry in the United States. So you'd begin to really create a virtuous circle of keeping jobs in America, and we would rebuild manufacturing in America by accelerating the development of new equipment. Third, everybody says they want to match China in job creation. China's got this great economic growth engine. Well, guess what? China has zero capital gains tax. So we think you ought to match China and have zero capital gains tax, and you would see money flow into the United States from all over the world to be invested in factories and in equipment and new companies, because we'd become suddenly the best market in the planet to make money. And I just want to point out, every time you look at sports, people who are winners happen to get better contracts. There's zero redistribution of wealth in sports. There's no sense of this modern model that says, you know, you should feel really bad if you're winning. Because after all, if you're winning, somebody's losing. Well, guess what? If we enable people to come to America to really do very well, and they end up actually making money by making money, and all of us have jobs because everybody's making money, so we're making money too. My answer to poverty is simple. Make sure everybody's making enough money that they're not in poverty, and then there won't be any poverty, and then the entire poverty industry will be gone, but it'll be okay because we'll be in a better country. Our fourth goal really relates directly to international companies like Procter & Gamble. It's very simple. We believe if you want American corporations to compete in the world, that we should adopt the Irish corporate tax rate, which is 12.5%. Today, American corporations, when you combine state and federal taxes, pay the highest corporate tax rate in the world. It's as though we're going to run a race, except our racer is going to carry a 60-pound pack on their back. And so we think, we got this, frankly, from Craig Barrett at Intel, and we believe if we had a 12.5% corporate rate, you'd see American corporations successfully compete everywhere on the planet. And when you combine that with being able to have a zero capital gains rate and being able to buy new equipment with a dramatic write-off, you suddenly make us the most competitive country in the world. You guarantee that the next wave of manufacturing is American manufacturing. You reestablish made in America as the right kind of outcome. And that allows other countries to then hold jobs. I want the next job summit 10 years from now in Beijing, where they worry about how to compete with the United States. Finally, we believe that you should permanently abolish the death tax. We agree at American Solutions with the 80% of the American people who say that if you work all your life, you save all your life, you do everything right all your life, the government shouldn't come in and take half of it away when you die, that's just fundamentally morally wrong. And that's why we would permanently abolish the death tax. Now, I was asked by a reporter today whether or not I thought there was an alternative to the $787 billion stimulus package, which had to be passed unread within a very short time, because otherwise unemployment would go above 8%. And I said, look, if we had taken the same $787 billion and invested it in the American Solutions tax cut program, we would have a dramatic decline in unemployment. You would see new factories being started, new companies being started, new jobs being created. And it would all be done without the politicians having more power and without the bureaucracy having more power, and we would not have bailed out local politicians. So that's kind of the starting framework for tonight. We believe it is possible to have a very successful program that fundamentally puts America back on the right tracks. And we believe that it is possible to make sure that we remain the country we've historically been for the last 400 years. But I want to make one last point about that, and then I'm going to toss it over to you, and we're going to have an opportunity for you to tell us whatever you think. I really believe, beyond economics, beyond jobs, the most important question in the next few years is, who are we? Historically, and Callista and I have done a movie called Rediscovering God in America, and a book by the same title that's a photographic walking tour of Washington. Historically, we were a people who in our very first founding political document said, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, there are two things that are really important about that definition of being an American. The first is, we're the only country in history that says that power comes from God to each one of you personally. That you are personally sovereign. God has, remember, it's inalienable. That means no judge, no president, no Congress, no bureaucrat can take away the rights that God has given you. It's a very, very bold statement. And in 1776, it was one of the most radical documents ever written. And it's the base of our freedom. It's why, under our system, our Constitution begins, we, the people of the United States. It doesn't say we, the politicians, we, the lawyers, we, the judges. It says we, the people, because we are loaning power. These guys in Washington who don't want to come back home to town hall meetings, it's exactly backwards. I keep trying to tell them, they hire you, you don't hire them. You need to go home and see the citizens. And frankly, that's why the Tea Party movement gained so much momentum, because people, Americans, have this instinctive belief that government is supposed to report to them. Unlike the European model, they're not supposed to report to government. It's a very fundamental difference. But there's a second part of that phrase. Remember what it says? We are endowed with the right to pursue happiness. I want you to think about that term, pursue. It's an active term. It's the base of the work ethic. Remember that Captain John Smith, the very first time people landed in the United States from England, that summer, 1607, Captain John Smith says, if you don't work, you're not going to eat. He doesn't say it to the poor, by the way. He says it to the aristocrats who thought they'd bought their passage and didn't have to work. He said, we don't have a big enough margin for you to live off the rest of us. So then they said, we don't want to work. He said, fine, if you don't work, you're not going to eat. That's all right. And they decided after a brief moment they would go to work. That was kind of the underlying base of the welfare reform we passed. But there are two things that derive from that. The first is you want to have a tax code that encourages the pursuit of happiness. You want a tax code that encourages success. It doesn't punish it. You want to have a tax code which encourages people to have an active life. It doesn't discourage them. There's a second thing. Notice what you have the right to. It doesn't say you have the right to happiness. And by the way, in the Scottish Enlightenment, where Jefferson got this term, happiness means virtue and wisdom. It doesn't mean hedonism and possessions. Very important thing to remember. I mean, the Founding Fathers were culturally very conservative. And they actually thought that virtue and wisdom were useful things to pursue. You get to pursue it. So that there's no right to happiness. There's no right to litigate if you're unhappy. There's no right to create a federal department of happiness. There's no program for happiness stamps so the unhappy can have access. And there's no provision for redistributing happiness so that we can take from those who are too happy to give to those who aren't happy enough. Now, the reason I wanted to end by talking about who we are is I think it's very important, whether it's in the city council, the school board, the county commission, the state government, or the federal government, it's very important when we start talking about inventing the programs of the future, whether they're health programs or education programs or the tax code, to ask ourselves the question, does it strengthen us being Americans? Does it strengthen individual responsibility? Does it strengthen the ability to pursue happiness? Does it strengthen the work ethic? If it does, it's probably a good idea. If it undermines those things, it's almost certainly a bad idea. And so I think there's a core value set that you want to measure all public policy against. It's not just what's the end over here, but what does it do to who we are in the process of going through it. So we believe if you encourage the development of permanent, really good jobs, and if you encourage the rise of a new generation of entrepreneurs, and if you strengthen small business, you in fact can create a tremendous wave of new jobs. They are permanent jobs, they are real jobs, they are competitive with China and India, and they enable our generation and our children and grandchildren to live in the most productive and most prosperous country in the world. And that's the underlying goal of the American Solutions Jobs Program. So what I'd like to do, and I don't quite know what the... Do we have microphones set up? How are we doing this? Okay, we have some microphones here, so why don't you guys jump up. And if you'll raise your hand, you two go to people when we have one person talking, go find another person. So raise your hand and you will be able to have... My only request would be identify yourself when you talk.
Hi, my name is Raymond Schneider, and I'm a job creator. And my solution is I need your help. I'm a Cincinnatian my whole life. I just this year created 300 jobs. Next year I'm trying to create 80 to 85 jobs in another city, Boston. I'm successful because in the last 10, 12 years, I've created over 1,000 jobs, and they're continually working today. They're not jobs about what I've seen with the TARP money. My local community just refinished the road, created a job, and in 4 weeks, they blacktopped it, and we now have the 1 million jobs that Obama supposedly gave us. I'm talking about jobs that last a long time. My 300 jobs are, I took a development in the community, and I took 29 acres, and I created a pet hotel, a retirement community, and it's real jobs, and they're available now. My problem is I can't do anything anymore. The government gave the banks funds to loan to the community. I'm part of that community, and I can't do anything anymore because the wind in my sail is gone. They did loan me money, but they loaned me the money that they loaned me before, and they told me they'll loan it to me again, but they doubled the cost of that, and now I'm in trouble. I can't create any more jobs. I need you, who's our representative of the government, to help me and other small businesses get to the next level. I'd be more than happy to share this at another time. I am a job creator, and I can't get anything done because the banks are not loaning money to us. They want my money so they can pay the government back their dues that they had taken, and now I cannot create any more jobs, and it's very difficult for me. And I got kids in school, I do the things like anybody else, I get dressed like everybody else, but I can't do anything because I'm in the middle of America, Cincinnati. So if I can excite you to help us, I look forward to that, and I'd love to share what I'm doing for next year. I have 85 jobs that are real. I own the real estate, I own the loan, and I have a gap financing that no one out there is there to help me. And I can only ask you to be my activist in this quest. And I think that quest relates to real jobs, 365 days a year to create the other 7, 8 jobs that each job creates beyond that. So I'm more than happy to share this at another time. Thank you.
Let me thank you for sharing with us. Dan Veroni, if you'd stand up over there. Dan, we'd like you to talk with Dan right afterwards because we'd like to work with you on this. Very
Thank you, and I appreciate it.
Is this on now? Okay. My name is Steve Conway. I'm a resident of Columbus, Ohio. I'm totally impressed with the American Solutions program that you've outlined for us. That gets us going, and one of my concerns is how do we sustain this? We have to have talent, and I'm very concerned about the education system that we have here in America. We have some tremendous challenges there, and I think from reading a lot of things that you've said that this is an area where you are also equally concerned, or significantly concerned. I do recall having read something that intrigues me, and I believe it's the country of Finland has made incredible progress in their educational system. They have what they describe as a love of learning. We've got to get there somehow. If we don't do that, we will not have the people that we need to sustain the programs that you put in place. Thank you.
I think that's a very important point. And that's why I said earlier that while we're focusing tonight on the immediate impact of creating jobs, in the long run you've got to also have another number of other reforms, and education is one of them. And probably one of the most daring things we've done at American Solutions, I've been going around the country with Secretary of Education Arne Duncan and with the Reverend Al Sharpton, and I have to confess up front, that's a fairly unusual combination. But this is an area where, frankly, we agree with the President. I would do more than he would do. I'm for Pell Grants for K through 12 so that every child has the right to go to the best school that they can find. But the President has had the willingness to come out and say that he is for a very strong charter school program in every state in the country where parents would know the quality of education their kids are getting and where parents would have the right to take their children to the school they want them to go to, not the school the bureaucracy assigns them to. And frankly, I think for a liberal Democrat, that's a pretty big step in the right direction. So we've agreed to go around and advocate that. I was in the Mastery School in Philadelphia. This was a school which 3 years ago was the second most violent school in Philadelphia and scored in the 25th percentile. It was so bad that the state took it over. They gave it to a charter program called Mastery. Now, it's the same building. It's the same inner city students. 3 years later, new teachers, new principal, and new system. They scored in the 86th percentile, 61 percentile jump. They have no violence. 100% of the 11th grade plans to go to college. This is all inner city kids. And we went and visited them. And one 11th grader said, we said, what's the difference? And he would talk about the old school and the new school as though they were different buildings, although it was the same building. And finally he said, you know, in the old school we used to fight all the time. And now we don't fight at all. And we said, well, why don't you fight? He said, well, they won't let us. And he said, they actually have classes on anger management for these kids. And he said, it's a very strict rule. He said, if I start a fight, I'll be thrown out. And I want to be here because I want to have a chance to go to college. And I said, well, what did you used to fight about? He said, junk. But we knew they expected us to fight, and we didn't want to disappoint them. And now we know we can't fight, and we don't want to disappoint them. Now, I think this is the same. This is inner city, very poor neighborhood, 3 years difference, because you finally had people who were focusing on establishing discipline, establishing learning, and giving the kids a sense of ambition. Now, I just wanted to tell you that story because I want you to know that I am very optimistic that with the right changes, with replacing bad systems with systems that work, we can move with amazing speed. That happened in 3 years in an inner city neighborhood. We can do it everywhere in America if we have the courage to insist that every child ought to have a chance to go to college instead of going to prison.
My name's Tom Marcinkavage. I'm from Florence, Kentucky. 2 questions for you, Mr. Speaker, regarding your tax proposals. What would you envision for personal income tax at the federal and state levels? And then with the reduced revenue that the federal government would obviously see, how would you plan on restructuring the federal government in order to survive on that reduced revenue flow?
Those are both very, very good questions. We don't actually deal directly with the personal income tax in this particular tax plan. We are looking at a couple of options, including an optional flat tax that would allow people to choose, if they wanted to, a one-page tax form that would be very simple and very clean. But that's not part of the immediate plan because we're focused directly on where things are. What we would do is we would block any tax increase. So we would keep the current tax rate that's in place and not allow taxes to go up during a recession because we think that's a guaranteed job killer. I believe, and I'll let you pick your own number. Let me just try this out. How many of you believe that at least 20% of the federal government is waste? Okay. So how many of you believe 30% of the federal government's waste? Okay. I'm not going to go any higher for the moment. 30% will do it for right now. We believe that if we were serious as a country, and when I was Speaker for 4 years, we did, as I said earlier, we did keep all spending down to 2.9% a year for 4 years, which is literally the lowest rate since the 1920s. And so if you with the current government, which is massively bigger than when I left the speakership, if you were to go through there and just cut out the fat and the waste, you would be astonished. And frankly, this is not just the federal government. If you were to go through every city in the country, every state, every county in the country, every school board in the country, every state in the country, you'd be shocked how much we've gotten to be sloppy. You look at the level of overhead Procter & Gamble has and the level of overhead Kroger has, and then go look at the level of overhead the university system has. And then you wonder why the cost goes up every year of tuition. And this is true everywhere in America. The Long Island Railroad, 97% of their retirees draw disability. 97%. Do you know what that's called? This is 2 + 2 = 4. It's called theft. They're stealing. Now, you may think this happened to be a New York Times story. I don't often get to quote the New York Times favorably, so I like to. But that is $250 million we have paid, the taxpayers have paid, to the Long Island Railroad retirees in the last decade in disability payments. My guess is that at least 80% of that's fraud. $200 million. We just published a book at the Center for Health Transformation called Stop Paying the Crooks. Again, it's bold, clear. Our estimate is that Medicare and Medicaid have between $70 and $120 billion a year in fraud. And when I say fraud, I don't mean marginal errors and people who made moo-boos. I mean 5 pizza parlors in Miami that filed as HIV/AIDS transfusion centers and were certified by state Medicaid. I mean a dentist in New York who filed 983 procedures a day. Do you know how incompetent the government has to be to pay for 983 procedures a day? So you look at that sort of thing and you say to yourself, if we were serious about restructuring the government and serious about replacing programs that don't work, could we get to a balanced budget while cutting taxes? My answer is yeah. But that means you've got to be prepared to be in a real fight because remember, you're now taking money. Somebody once said to me, my idea of waste is somebody else's idea of an income. And so you're going to be in a real fight. But I think we can draw some lines here and say the American people, in order to compete in the world market, need to have a smaller, leaner, more effective government, and we're for whatever level of change that requires.
Good evening. My name is Marjorie Mosley. I am a native Cincinnati, product of public school, Catholic school, and the University of Cincinnati. I am looking for a job. I am unemployed. I had R1 credit when I purchased my home, so I didn't get a house that I couldn't afford. I am here because this is a real jobs summit. I want to know if there are employers in the room. If anyone is hiring, I am looking for a job. I want to go back to work. I am here because I want to go back to work. I have looked, and I just told the lady here that I have varied skills. I have worked in the public school system where my students did not expect to fight. And when I see them today who have graduated, they are on their way to college. I have worked for the unions. I have worked in customer service collections, and I have worked in corrections. So my skills are varied. I want to go back to work. Mr. Gendrich.
Good. Thank you. And I think anybody who is looking for an employee, if you want to talk to her later on, she will be here. Thank you. Okay. Let's see. Where's the next?
Hi, my name's Cynthia Foyles, and I live in Clifton. And first, Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to say that I was probably one of the happiest people in Naperville, Illinois on election night in 1994. And with your election and contract with America, you gave a lot of us hope, especially in the early 90s under the Clinton administration. I come to you tonight as a grandmother. I have 4 grandsons, 2, 4, 12, and 18. And I'm very concerned about them and how I can have an impact now on their education. My oldest is a freshman at the University of Cincinnati. And after 2 months, he is now convinced that South Africa's economy is better than ours, that the city of Cincinnati's unemployment rate is under control, and we're on our way to prosperity. I have nieces and nephews in high school attending public schools who are now comparing President Obama to Cicero after 1 year, 7th, 8th grader. I have a 2-year-old and 4-year-old who live in Memphis. I want to know how I can protect my 2, 4, 12-year-old and have an impact on my 18-year-old's education prospects so that they can compete in a global economy, but as Americans, not as citizens of the world. Thank you.
Well, let me say, first of all, I do think that education reform is going to be a very controversial and very important part of this, because all too many of our academic institutions are totally biased and teach what I think is a fantasy. And I think we have to be prepared to say that. And that may lead to some real arguments over what's appropriate and over holding people accountable. I'll also say that it's fascinating to me. I didn't realize this until we did a workshop recently in the fall of the Berlin Wall, the 20th anniversary. And somebody pointed out to me at the time that in 1988, the CIA estimate was that the East German economy was bigger than the West German economy. Now, when the wall fell, it turned out that, in fact, this was off by about a factor of 30. Not 3, 30. And that the East German economy was collapsing totally, and that it took billions of Deutschmarks from the West to prop them up in order to go through the unification of Germany. I only cite that as an example because the ability of the academic left to be self-deceptive is quite remarkable. And I think you have to argue with the 18-year-old and see if you can vaccinate the 3 younger ones against what's going to happen to them. The encouraging news is that at some point they get away from the professor. They earn their first paycheck. They realize how much the government is ripping them off. And they move about 70 points to the right sometime that first week. And I'm amazed by the time they're 25 or 30, they're moving back towards the values of their parents and have begun to figure out that their professor was living in a fantasy land. But I don't know that we have an obligation to pay a professoriate to have lifetime tenure to teach fantasies. And so I think... I will also say very modestly that if you get a chance to show your younger grandchildren our movie, Rediscovering God in America, it'll give them sort of a pretty good grounding to survive whatever's going to happen to them. See? Yeah.
I appreciate the fact that you talk about Americans having to take a look at who they are and what type of society we are creating. And my concern is about the fact that we reduce the spoils of winning and we reduce the penalties for failing. And in my industry, I own a small manufacturing business. The penalties for failing is bankruptcy, losing my mortgage, my house, my marriage, and anything else that goes with that. But in our current society, and the idea of the overreaching safety net, that there is no failure, that we all succeed, and that the government uses all kinds of our tax money to distribute incentives to things that may or may not be economically feasible. The energy policy being one that handpicks industries to succeed and penalizes those that may succeed without government intervention. And how can we get back to an economic model that is based on the idea that supply and demand and profits and penalties are what create a dynamic society?
Well, I think what you just said is very, very important. I've often thought that if you think about the sports page as compared to the political page, and the sports page, we tend to interview the person who won. Again, those of you at the University of Cincinnati have had a good year, so you can identify with this. In the sports page, we tend to say that winners ought to get, a bigger medal than losers. And we actually use words like winners and losers. On the political page, if the sports page was written by the New York Times political editors, they would find the losingest coach in America. And there would be a page one story about the agony of defeat and the degree to which he felt unhappy at having lost every game. And the fact that he couldn't recruit anybody because they didn't want to come and play for a team that was losing all the time. And he thought this was unfair and that really good athletes ought to be forced to come to his school, because why don't we have a redistribution of scholarships so that the worst school in America gets the first choice of the best athletes, because it's so unfair that they keep getting recruited by good teams with good coaches. When shouldn't bad teams with bad coaches have a fair chance of getting people too? And you'd look at it and you'd think, are these guys nuts? And there'd be an editorial page policy that there shouldn't be a World Series, because the World Series allows somebody to call themselves champions, and champion is such a, egocentric, emotional, dominant term, when we should all be friends. Think of the New York Yankees as your friends. The 2009 Friends of the World. In sports, we've still retained the old America. We retain a place that said you go out and you work hard, you develop your skills, you do the best you can. There's no guarantee you're going to win, but we want to give you a shot at it, okay? I think, and this is part of why we created American Solutions, I think most Americans want their country to be that kind of country. They want to be able to say to their children and their grandchildren, I don't guarantee you success, but I guarantee you a shot at it. The journey, getting up in the morning and trying, learning, failing but learning from your failure, trying a second and a third time, that's really what has made America successful. My younger daughter and I, Jackie Cushman, we wrote a book this year called 5 Principles for a Successful Life, based on things I used to tell students for years and years, and she was busy telling them to Maggie and Robert, and we got people like General Petraeus to contribute to it, and Whoopi Goldberg and a bunch of different people. And there are 5 principles. Dream big, work hard, learn every day, enjoy life, and be true to yourself. Now, nowhere in there does it say, give up early, ask somebody to subsidize you, fail with a sense of gratefulness that others will feel sorry for you while you're failing. Think about the whole model that's wrong. What we're trying to do at American Solutions is lay the base of a conversation to bring together a vast majority who we believe will reaffirm the original American system, and then go out, frankly, and defeat the people who don't get it. I mean, not that they're necessarily bad people, they're just wrong. You know, and so if you were going to a restaurant every day where every time you ordered fried eggs, they put them in the freezer, it wouldn't take you very many mornings to decide that that was not the place you ought to have breakfast. And it wouldn't take you long to say to the owner, you know, I don't think the cook is quite ready. Well, that's what we have in Washington. We have a whole group of people who every time we say, why don't you create jobs, they say, great, we're going to create 5 more bureaucracies, 7 more lawsuits, and raise your taxes. And by the way, that's also true in Columbus. I mean, you look around the city governments in this country, because the politicians don't see the connectivity between opportunities and jobs and long-term wealth creation. And so they're pretty cheerful about, they always think they can load one more brick on top of the camel until the camel falls over. Now, I'll give you one closing example of that, and then we'll go to the next person. I went to see Mayor Reardon, who is a very, very smart mayor of Los Angeles. And we were talking about the challenges of big cities in America. And Reardon was personally very wealthy. And after they had some riots in East LA, a good friend of his called and said, you know, I really want to help you succeed. I'm going to put a factory in your poorest neighborhood, and I'm going to hire the people in that neighborhood, and we're going to prove that you can actually create prosperity in the middle of poverty. So the guy calls him back a year later. And he said, I can't do it. And Reardon said, well, why not? He said, we can't work through your bureaucracy to get the permit. And in virtually every big city in America, the regulatory red tape permitting process is such a nightmare for small business that it kills them. And so you raised exactly the right point, and you just put your finger on one of the key things. We're trying to reset America back into a world of success, a world of effort, a world of achievement, and we think it's doable, and we think most Americans want that kind of future.
Speaker Gingrich, I want to thank you for coming. We all believe in you here. I'm here today to find out what I can do for you. My name is Michael Keitel. I'm a local creative director at an ad agency here in Cincinnati. And I don't have a lot of money to give, but I do have time, I have talents, and I'm looking for somebody to tell us how we can make this happen. I'm with you 100% on all of this. So tell me what to do.
Well, let me say, we'd love to have your help at American Solutions. That's exactly what we're looking for. We want your help in, and let me be very clear. All we are is the initial opportunity for you to save your own country. It's not like, you know, if you send us money or if you do something, we're going to go do it. We're going to try to help you figure out how to get it done. There are 513,000 elected officials in the United States. 513,000. School board, city council, county commission, sheriff, state legislature. It's amazing. To truly fix the country, you have to have a wave of change. So we'd love to have your help at local levels. We'd love to have your help at state levels. We'd love to have your help at federal levels. You can go to AmericanSolutions.com and see what you're doing. Adam, could you just stand up? Adam Waldeck will be glad to talk to you right afterwards. Adam runs one of our programs, and he'd be glad to chat with you about how you might be active. And I really would love to have you get involved.
Tess. Good evening, sir. Thank you for attending tonight. My name is Dennis Lucan. I was born and raised in Cincinnati and have spent most of my life working multiple jobs. It's the last 34 years in law enforcement. My question to you, is it realistic that the expectation that the voters in America will ever see a piece of legislation ever passed that's in the best interest of the voters or your constituents without input or special interest or lobbyists? And second part, will we ever see an elimination of lobbyists in this country when it comes to legislation?
Well, let me say, first of all, I don't think you'll ever see an elimination of lobbyists but lobbyists are one of the best arguments for smaller government. I mean, why do you have so many lobbyists in Columbus, and why do you have so many lobbyists in Washington? Because the governments are so big, because there's so much money. And the Jeffersonian model, and what Thomas Jefferson wrote about a frugal, limited government, was directly related to the problem of corruption, because all of the Founding Fathers believed that, having watched the British monarchy, that big government is inherently corrupting. It's corrupting in the sense that there's just too much money. There are too many advantages. There's too much power. And so what happens is, you know, in a marketplace, if I have a product and I come to the market and you're the customer, if you don't like my product, you don't buy it. But if I'm a clever lobbyist and I can get you to decide we're going to do it through the bureaucracy, then we do it even if you don't want it. And we take your money involuntarily in taxes, and we make you pay for it even if you think it's stupid. And that's why we've got to go back to a basic conversation about markets versus bureaucracies as a way of solving things. And so I would say the number one way to reduce lobbyists is reduce government. If there's a lot smaller government, there's a lot less reason to hire a lobbyist. If the market is bigger, you spend your time pleasing the customer. If the government's bigger, you spend your time manipulating the politicians. So I think it's that straightforward.
My name is Scott Sankson, and I want to thank you for coming to Cincinnati to visit us, to where we can speak with you one-on-one. I'm a history buff, and I was fortunate enough that my parents put me through private school where I would learn history the way that they did. My concern as a conservative are the historical revisionists. We learned today that Gorbachev ended the Cold War and that our founding fathers were atheists. I know that God is at the core of our country, and we are a Christian nation. My coworkers, I have some younger coworkers who recently graduated from college. They're very educated people. But they think that the Obama agenda, or maybe just socialism in general, this redistribution of wealth, is something new and exciting. But they just don't know that it's been tried and it's failed. I feel so frustrated because I know better. I'm 35 years old. I'm not much older than these college grads. How can such a generation lose touch with what real history is? What can we do as conservatives to preserve our American heritage, our history, keep God in the spotlight, and keep things the way they were when they happened?
Well, that's a pretty there's several different things in that thing. Let me say, first of all, your friends, Margaret Thatcher once said what's wrong with socialism is you presently run out of other people's money to spend. I think as your friends watch the failure of government, they will rapidly. This administration is going to give the country one of the great educations of all time, because I think that, I mean, if you just look at the polling numbers on the stimulus package now, where a substantial majority believes it has failed. The Obama health plan has lost 9 percentage points of support since he started talking about it. And is now, a clear minority. Gallup recently showed a 22% switch from health care as a government responsibility to health care as a personal responsibility. Every fifth American has dropped off of government onto personal responsibility. For the first time in the history of the poll, more people said it was a personal responsibility than a government responsibility. The longer these guys talk, the more conservative the country's going to get, because you listen to them for a little while and you realize, well, that doesn't make any sense. And so I think you're going to see, a continued effort to move in this direction. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be overnight, and it doesn't mean it's going to be immediate. But you went to a second point, and again, I want to mention, if you get a chance, we have 2 movies on rediscovering God in America. Part 1 is a walking tour of the national monuments in Washington. Part 2, that's the original one, and then Rediscovering God in America 2 is from the colonial founding to the Civil War. And for example, very few schools anymore teach that the very first thing that the colonists did when they came to Virginia in 1607 was stop at Cape Henry and erect a cross to thank God for having crossed the Atlantic. And that cross is still there because the ACLU hasn't found it yet. So let me give you two specific examples, because I think, remember I said 2 + 2 = 4? Okay, I decided to take the courts head on when the Ninth Circuit Court ruled that saying one nation under God in the Pledge of Allegiance was unconstitutional. And I want you to know as a historian, there is no provision for the court to be the final arbiter of the Constitution. It is only a supreme court within the courts. It is not supreme over the Congress, and it is not supreme over the president. I taught an entire course at the University of Georgia Law School last spring on this topic. Now, I say that to you for this reason. In 1802, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who between them knew a fair amount about the Constitution, they passed a bill called the Judicial Reform Act of 1802. What had happened was, after they won the election of 1800, back then you didn't get sworn in until March. In the intervening period between the election in November and their taking over in March, their opponents doubled the number of federal judges. From 17, they added 18 more to 35. And said, these are lifetime judges. We've now stacked the judiciary. There's nothing you can do about it. We're in charge. And the Jeffersonians arrived, and they were fairly angry about this, because it all happened after these guys had all lost the election. You know, those of you who are angry because Congress isn't listening to you on health care or whatever you're mad about, imagine how these guys felt. They had just won, they won by a landslide. So they said, well, actually, we don't have to impeach anybody. And in the Judicial Reform Act of 1802, they disestablished all 18 judges. They said, you don't have a job, you don't have a court, you're not going to get paid, you have no clerks, you can hear no... And the 18 judges were furious. They said, hey, you can't do this. So several of them went and tried to file a suit in the remaining 17 courts. And guess what the judge said when they tried to file the suit? He said, are you crazy? If I allow you to file this suit, they're going to abolish my job. Now, I cite this to you because Jefferson literally wiped out over half the federal judges in one bill. I am much more reasonable. I would only wipe out the Ninth Circuit. And hopefully that would send a signal of seriousness. Now, 2 more steps. Rick Tyler, who works with us at another organization called Renewing American Leadership, yesterday drove out in the Mojave Desert to find a cross. You know what? One of the things I say about the Polish communist government was it's hard to imagine, but this was a dictatorship which would take down crosses and blocked people from praying in school. It's hard to imagine a government would do that. And so Tyler went out yesterday to find there's a cross. I want you to imagine this. In 1934, in the middle of the Depression, the Desert Valley Post of the Veterans of Foreign Wars erected a cross in the Mojave Desert to honor the American dead from World War I. And a few years ago, a government employee decided they were offended because, think about this phrase, in the middle of the Mojave Desert, there's a cross. Now, do you know how nuts you have to be threatened by a cross in the middle of the Mojave Desert? So yesterday, we sent Rick out to film the cross. He said you go from Los Angeles out on 15 towards Nevada, you turn and go 8 miles on a secondary road to find this cross, which is currently covered with plywood because it's in the middle of a lawsuit. Now, there's something sick about a federal judiciary that is threatened by a cross in the middle of the desert. And it's a denial of the concept of freedom in the United States. Last example. I don't care if they use our particular book, Rediscovering God in America, but every school should use an accurate book that teaches the real history of the relationship of the Founding Fathers. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My name is Charlie Hart. I have a local business that sells and markets to a wide variety of manufacturing job shops, and you can imagine it's been an interesting last couple of years. I have a couple of points. By the way, I'm a subscriber to American Solutions. I've been so for a year, and I want to thank you for being one of the few guys of a national prominence that actually focuses on results rather than the process of legislating. And I would suggest you add to your list of 5 things another one, and that is the habitual behavior of politicians to tax first dollar payrolls. That is, the first dollar of anybody you hire is going to get hit with a wide array of taxes up to $5,000 or $10,000 and beyond. In addition to that, we are obligated in some cases for health care or unemployment and workers' comp and all these other things, which encourages the consideration of temps in many cases where you have jobs where the future is uncertain. And I would suggest to you that attacking those first dollar payroll attacks would be a helpful thing in job creation. And in terms of some good news for people, you might confirm the fact the United States economy is by far the world's biggest. It's about 20% of the globe. It represents an economy at least the size of numbers 2, 3, and 4 combined, and maybe number 5 as well, depending upon current situation. And secondly, we are far and away the world's biggest manufacturer in dollar values. Anyway, that's a little good news. Thank you.
First of all, let me say, if you had talked to Dan Veroni afterwards, I am very interested in your idea that we should figure out the first dollar cost imposed, not just taxes, total cost imposed on the next hire by government in all of its various forms, which will increase by state. That is, my hunch is that Ohio and New York are more expensive proportionally than, say, Idaho and Arizona. So it'd be interesting to look both at the federal costs that are added and at the state and local costs that are added to the first, so that the government is artificially raising the cost of employment. If you don't mind talking to Dan, that would be a very, very interesting thing. Let me reinforce what you said a second ago, and I want to apologize. I'm going to have to run in a minute because I've got to go and be on Hannity. We're going to tape from right here in the hotel in a couple of minutes. But I want to reinforce what you said a second ago, because while we have problems, nobody should exaggerate where we are. I remember in 1987, 1988, people writing books about the emerging Japanese superstate. Japan is number 1, all this stuff. And at one point, a good friend of mine was walking with me on the mall, and he said, "Do you realize that today the Imperial Gardens in Tokyo are worth more than the entire real estate in Florida?" And I just said to him, as a historian, "That's nuts." I said, "That is a bubble. It is impossible." And a year later, the Japanese economy collapsed, and they've never fully recovered. We are today about the same size proportionately we were in 1913 of the entire planet. We're a fourth of it. We're the biggest economy on the planet. The problem is that we've spent the last 25 years pretending that 2 + 2 = 19, that you could borrow and live beyond your means, that you could destroy your industrial base, that you could somehow create fantasy, the 2 great fantasies of the left, which are internet jobs and green jobs. I mean, they're never real jobs. There's always sometime in the near future we're all going to earn a great deal of money doing something no one's doing today, because that will be something that will be very exciting. But all the stuff we're doing today is just really work, and that's not very exciting. So why would you want to lower taxes to increase real work when, in fact, you could think about the fantasy that's going to come someday? That's nonsense. It's time to just relax, roll up our sleeves. We can clearly be the biggest manufacturing country for the next 50 years. If we don't have government crippling us, we are the most integrated society on the planet. People come from everywhere to create wealth in America. And we have fewer problems. I just want to close with this notion, because I want you to really think about this. The President recently visited China. Clifton and I spent a good bit of time in China in August. If I had to choose between our economic tummy ache with our political system and their fairly good economic run with their political system, I have no doubt which is going to be the more flexible and the more change-oriented over the next 30 years. The American people can take back their government. The American people can impose on their politicians a generation of change. The American people can fire the politicians who don't listen. We have enormous opportunities. The Chinese are trapped in a rigid, corrupt dictatorship, which in the long run is a lot worse investment for the future than the United States of America. And that's why, with your help at American Solutions, I think we can create the positive solutions that rally the country to create a dramatically better future. Thank you very, very much. I've got to run to...
Winter getting colder, summer getting warmer, tidal wave come across the Mexican border. Wide back gal